Today we are looking at a case from the very end of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to Australia. Margaret Heffernan, otherwise known as Maggie, was born in 1878. She had a sheltered upbringing and was brought up on her parents' farm near Gundowring in Victoria, which at the time was an independent colony in Australia. It was not until the beginning of 1901 that the colony became a state, following a proclamation by Her Majesty Queen Victoria. During the 1880s, many Europeans migrated to Australia. The country was experiencing a period of prosperity and there was much available work. However, in the early 1890s, the Australian economy fell into a severe depression. Investment from abroad decreased and there was a significant rise in unemployment. So much so that many people sought the help of relief societies in order to obtain food. When Maggie was 21 years old, she left her parents' farm and took up a position in domestic service for the Hayes family, who lived just outside the town of Albury. Mr. Fred Hayes was a farmer and also kept the local mill. Maggie was a fine employee. She was very polite, and Mrs. Hayes was always very pleased with her work. She stayed in the employment of the family for a little over a year before she suddenly left, telling Mrs. Hayes that she had met a young gentleman and was going to be married. It seemed as though she had been seeing a local young man who had been working nearby. Maggie was a very pretty girl, and there had always been young gentlemen who were interested to make her acquaintance. However, the young man that she had been seeing was already well known in the community and was considered by those who knew him to be a bit of a flirt, although this may just have been a kind way of describing his improper behaviour. Maggie, however, did not get married, and a few months later returned home to live with her parents. Her mother soon became concerned for Maggie's health. She certainly did not seem herself, so after a few days, Mrs. Heffernan called the local doctor. He determined that she was suffering from physical weakness and needed to rest. However, Maggie was in the early stages of pregnancy. Although the attitude towards unmarried mothers had started to change, even at the very end of the 19th century, a young lady who was unmarried and pregnant was looked down upon by certain sections of society and would usually find it considerably more difficult to find a husband. Maggie continued to live with her family and managed to keep the pregnancy a secret. When she was around 7 months pregnant, she suddenly left. She went to Melbourne to apparently meet the father of her unborn child, who she now thought was going to marry her. However, when she arrived, she learned that he had just given her a false address and a false hope of becoming a respectable married lady. She did not want to go back to her parents' house and explain the situation for which she now found herself. Although she knew that they would not abandon her, they were honourable and virtuous people, and she did not want them to be the subject of local gossip. Although she did not have very much money, was unmarried, and with child, Maggie decided to stay in Melbourne. She managed to obtain a position at a hotel owned by a gentleman named Mr. Ralph, and even though she was pregnant, she did her best to disguise her condition. Her circumstances did not look very favourable, but she was aware that the city did have female hospitals and female refuges, which helped young pregnant women, many who were like herself, poor and alone and shunned by society. On the 29th of December 1899, Maggie went into labour at the hotel and gave birth to a baby boy who she named George. The owner was very supportive and sent for a doctor to come and help. The owner's wife, Mrs. Ralph, then accompanied Maggie to the women's hospital. On the birth certificate, she didn't name the father and changed her own name to Joanna Margaret Heffernan. She stayed in the hospital for 11 days, which was usual at the time. The nurses described her as a good mother. She cared for her baby, fed him, and looked after him well. Of course, the hospital was very busy, and after her 11 days were up, she had to leave. She went to Mrs. Cameron's home in Armadale, a place designed for unmarried young women with babies. She was allowed to stay there for an additional 2 weeks. For some reason, however, she left this establishment after just 6 days. She did tell one of the other young ladies that the baby was going to be cared for by the father's mother, and before she left, she wrote a letter to her parents explaining her situation. She then went to the post office and mailed it. However, unbeknown to Maggie, the post office burnt to the ground that very day, so the letter was destroyed and never reached her parents. Although Maggie's parents had always been very caring, they were also strict and religious, and Maggie had been nervous writing to them. So when she heard no response, she assumed that she didn't have their support. When Maggie left Mrs. Cameron's home in Armadale, she returned to Melbourne, but things soon became quite difficult. When trying to find a place to stay for the night, she was turned away, as they all considered themselves to be respectable establishments and would not accept an unmarried young lady and her baby. She had very little money, and with so many places unwilling to support her situation, her options were very limited. Eventually, a kind woman directed her to a restaurant, where she managed to get a bed for herself and baby George for the night. By now she was very tired, hungry, dehydrated, and still recovering from having given birth just 3 weeks prior. She was confused and was not in a very good state of mind. The next day she got up, and after being given a cup of tea, she left the restaurant. It was now Tuesday the 16th of January 1900, summer in Australia, and it was another hot day in Melbourne. Maggie had nowhere to go. Instead, she just aimlessly walked the streets, sat in the parks, and contemplated her situation, all the time while trying to look after her 3-week-old baby. She knew that she would have to try and find employment. She was hard-working, young, and was sure that her previous employers would give her a very good reference. She purchased the local paper, hoping that there may be something suitable for her to do, but she was unmarried and had a baby of her own. Finding a position that would accommodate her situation would be extremely difficult. The next day, Wednesday the 17th of January, Maggie returned to the women's hospital. She was very sad and informed the doctor that her baby had died. She asked if there may be a position as a wet nurse. This was an occupation where a woman would feed another woman's baby, if for whatever reason she was unable to feed the baby properly herself. It had been common practice since the mid-18th century, but by 1900 there had been advances in synthetic feeding practices, which had resulted in less positions for wet nurses. While Maggie was speaking to the doctor, a labourer who was working at the South Melbourne wharf saw something floating in the water. He retrieved it and realised that it was the body of a recently born baby boy. He immediately contacted the police. Men, women and babies had previously been found in the River Yarra, where they would then often float into Port Phillip Bay and then out to sea. It was presumed that many bodies, especially those of babies, were never found. The police needed to identify the little boy, so wrapped the baby in a blanket and went to the women's hospital, the obvious place to go first. The baby found in the river matched the age of Maggie's recently deceased baby, and Maggie had just started to work as a wet nurse that very day. The doctor had realised that she was in a very vulnerable state and immediately wondered if the baby the police had recovered may be the child who Maggie had given birth to just 3 weeks earlier. The police spoke to her, but she reassured them that the baby was not in fact George. She told them that she had given her baby to the father's mother, who lived in Sydney. She told an elaborate story about the lady who she claimed to be the baby's grandmother, who she respectfully referred to as Mrs. Hardy. She said that when she left Mrs. Cameron's home in Armadale, she travelled by train to meet Mrs. Hardy. They'd agreed to meet in Wangaratta, a city in northeastern Victoria. She added that that night they had all stayed in a hotel before parting ways the following morning. Maggie even gave police the name of the hotel that they had supposedly stayed in. She also told them that Mrs. Hardy lived at 204 King Street in Sydney. Of course, the police checked her story. The hotel did in fact exist, but neither Margaret Heffernan or Mrs. Hardy had stayed there, and Mrs. Hardy did not live at 204 King Street in Sydney. Maggie was questioned for a second time and began to change her story, but again, the police did not believe what she was telling them. "Tell us the truth," they said. Upon hearing this, she broke down and said, "Yes, I know I did wrong." She handed police officers the little gown and flannel and confessed to drowning her baby in the River Yarra. She tearfully said, "I walked up and down the riverside for about an hour. I then sat down with the baby. He was clothed with a little gown and a small piece of flannel. I sat close to the edge of the water. I took the gown and flannel off the baby. I then let the baby drop gently into the river. The baby was alive when I dropped him. I didn't look to see if he sank or not. I then walked away. It was around 1 p.m. at the time." Margaret Heffernan was then arrested and charged with the murder of her son George. She was sent to Melbourne prison, where she was placed in the hospital wing in an apparent state of exhaustion. Despite her previous confession, Miss Margaret Heffernan pleaded not guilty. Her defence claimed that she had been suffering from postnatal depression, and it was revealed that after she had drowned her baby, Maggie had caught the train back to the hotel owned by Mr. and Mrs. Ralph and had stayed the night there. She told them that George had died at the hospital shortly after his birth. Mrs. Ralph testified that she looked weak and ill at the time. No witnesses were called to support Maggie or to comment on the claim that she had postnatal depression. It was common during trials to have people testify to the accused's good character, but this did not happen on this particular occasion. The judge was therefore left with no choice but to seek some enlightenment from the doctors who were there to give evidence for the prosecution. The judge asked them, "In your judgment, could the defendant have been suffering from postnatal depression?" Both of the doctors replied that a woman who suffered from postnatal depression would be unable to afterwards give clear account of her actions. The proceedings only lasted for 40 minutes before the judge turned to the jury and said, "While this case is very sad, it is perhaps more painful because it was so extremely plain. The issue you, the jury, have to deal with is whether or not the accused woman intentionally took her child to the river to drown it. If the young woman intentionally dropped her child into the river, she is guilty of the charge of murder." When Dr. Stalwell was asked whether she would be able to state what had occurred if she had been suffering from a temporary mania to which women were liable, the doctor had answered that she would not. Yet here was her description of the whole of her movements at the time of the crime. That the woman was hard-pressed was beyond question, and all that might demand sympathy, but it did not prevent her from legal responsibility. The jury returned to ask if the verdict of manslaughter could be given, but the judge told them that it could not. He said that they had to decide whether the defendant had intentionally, even if under pressure of her circumstances, committed the crime. The jury later returned to find the defendant, Miss Margaret Heffernan, guilty of murder, but strongly recommended mercy based on her weakness, her mental health, and her situation. Unfortunately, the judge had no choice in what sentence was delivered. There was only one sentence for anyone who had committed murder, and that sentence was death by hanging. Upon hearing her sentence, Miss Margaret Heffernan fainted and then had to be carried out of court. There was an immediate reaction to the conviction. The public was outraged. The press was then inundated by letters from its readers, and a petition was started seeking mercy for Maggie. During a 3-week period, over 15,000 people signed it. Friends and neighbours came forward, telling of her kind and gentle nature and previous unblemished character. The families for whom she had worked told of what a hard-working, polite and conscientious young lady she was. Her case was supported by the prominent social reformer, Vida Goldstein, who a year earlier had become the secretary for the United Council for Women's Suffrage. She went to see Maggie in prison and wrote about her plight in the publication The Australian Woman's Sphere. Now the case of Miss Margaret Heffernan was becoming well known not just in Victoria, but throughout Australia. Vida Goldstein reminded everyone that this poor young lady had been sentenced to death, but where was the father of the child? He had just abandoned her while she carried the baby, gave birth, and was then supposed to raise her son alone. The father, however, was completely absolved from any responsibility, when it was in fact his actions that had put the young lady in such a vulnerable and helpless situation. The interest and the attention that the case had generated caused the authorities to question whether the trial was fair and whether Miss Heffernan's medical condition had been properly assessed. The whole case needed to be reviewed. While in prison, Maggie again became ill and was again admitted to the prison hospital. This time the doctors diagnosed tuberculosis, although it is unlikely that this diagnosis was correct. It did, however, cause for another petition, calling for her to be freed. With so much public opinion in her favour and the belief that she was of no risk to society, in December 1901, after serving less than 2 years, Miss Margaret Heffernan was released from prison. After spending some time with her parents, she managed to rebuild her life. now being known as Greta rather than Maggie. In 1909, she married a man named Joseph Henderson, and together they had 2 children. In 1915, Joseph was killed in a railway accident. He had been working as a train driver for the Druin butter factory and was hit by a train while unloading. This was another tragic event in Maggie's life and left her a widow. Fortunately, her parents had been living close by and were able to help her bring up her children. Margaret Heffernan died in February 1966 at the age of 88. She was buried in the Bunyip Cemetery along with her husband and her parents. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case